Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. We will give it about a minute or two here to allow people to tune in here before we get started. But in the meantime, I just want to ask those that are joining us here. Looks like we've got 180 already in the room here. You'll see on the right side of your page here, you'll see there's a chat box, there's a chat tab, and there's a Q&A tab. Go ahead and drop in the chat tab where you're calling in from today. We always like to see, Philip, you've already got it. Manchester, New Hampshire is already in the house. Ireland's. I'll drop where I'm calling in from here. I'm calling from Cincinnati. Another Irelander, Dublin, Germany, Missouri, Switzerland, Netherlands, Spain, Malmo, Sweden, UK. We've got lots and lots of people from both the US side, where I'm at here, as well as across the ways there. Yvonne, where are you based again? Would you remind me where you're calling in from?
Yeah, I'm based in Ireland, Galway, Ireland. So I can see a lot of islands coming up there.
Many of your countrymen there coming in. Okay, yeah. Perfect. We'll give it another 30 seconds or so here. It's always exciting to see how many people are calling in. This is great. And thank you to everybody dropping it in here. We'll go ahead and get started. We've got 242. We're at 2 minutes past here. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Our topic today is clinical submissions, do's and don'ts, and we're going to hear tips from a former notified body expert. By way of introduction, my name is Chris Rush. I'm a solutions engineer here at Greenlight Guru, and I'll be the moderator for today's event. Today's session will run for about 60 minutes in total, but we might stretch more at the end depending on the amount of questions we get in. And we have 260 here already, so I anticipate we'll get some of those. This will not be a traditional presentation. Instead, it's more of an interview style session where I'll be asking Dr. Yvonne a series of questions, and she'll share her insights and experiences. Think of this more as a deep dive conversation with an expert designed to give you practical advice that you can use, hopefully. For those who are new to our webinars, let me quickly walk through the interface. Looks like many of you are familiar. You jumped right into the chat. On the right side, just to remind those who have not been in here before, on the right side of your screen, you'll see a few tabs. There's the chat tab. Use this to engage with other attendees. Post general comments in there, such as where you're calling in from. That's great. There is a separate Q&A tab, so please do clue in for this comment I'm about to make. There's the Q&A tab. Specifically, this is where you should drop or submit any questions you'd like Dr. Yvonne to address during the Q&A portion, which will be at the end of our discussion here. Please make sure to use the Q&A tab only for questions, as we don't want to be monitoring the general chat for questions. So please do use that Q&A specifically for questions. After the webinar today, we'll send a follow-up email to all registrants with the full recording and the slides, so you can revisit today's discussion at your convenience as well. Now, I'd like to share a few words about Greenlight Guru and why we put on these free training sessions. So improving the quality of life for our customers and their patients is our mission here at Greenlight Guru, likely a similar mission as many of you joining today. At Greenlight Guru, our focus is on moving medtech forward. That means helping you get your life-changing medical devices to market and keeping them there over time. We know the challenges that medical device companies face in a very heavily regulated industry, and our solutions are designed to help streamline your processes so you can navigate the regulatory hurdles and succeed in the market. Greenlight Guru provides medical device companies with industry-leading quality management system, software, and electronic data capture software solutions to scale faster, becoming more efficient, and reducing risk throughout the product lifecycle. Today's webinar will focus on giving you expert insights into submitting complete and compliant clinical submissions for CE marking. At Greenlight Guru, we built the leading toolbox for pre-market clinical data collection and management. Specifically designed for medtech operations, Greenlight Guru is a single compliant platform for collection and management of all clinical evidence, safety, and performance data. If you're interested in learning more about this system and how it can help you streamline your clinical data for clinical investigations or otherwise, you can schedule a demo with us. You'll probably be speaking with myself by clicking on the Get EDC demo button at the top of the screen. and following the link in the prompt. Now let's turn our attention to today's special guest, Dr. Yvonne Ndefo. Dr. Yvonne is a seasoned medical doctor with extensive experience in both clinical practice and medical device regulation. Her background includes years of hands-on clinical practice in surgery and emergency medicine, where she gained a deep understanding of patient care and clinical procedures. Yvonne has also worked for 8 years as a clinical evaluator and then Chief Clinical Evaluator for NSAI, a notified body based in Ireland. In these roles, she assessed the safety and effectiveness of numerous medical devices, ensuring compliance with CE marking requirements and EU MDR regulations. Currently, Dr. Yvonne is a consultant specializing in medical devices, helping companies with clinical documentation preparation, clinical strategy development, clinical investigations, and training on regulatory requirements for clinical evaluations under the EU MDR. And Dr. Yvonne, we're thrilled to have you here with us here today. Her insider perspective really is invaluable. We know you'll gain a lot from the insights that she'll share here today. And thank you again, Dr. Yvonne, for being here with us. Now let's dive in and get started with the discussion, if that's okay.
Thanks for having me.
So let's hop right in. Yeah. First question here, Yvonne, can you briefly explain the importance of clinical evaluation documentation in the context of medical device regulatory submissions? We'll start there.
Well, I suppose clinical evaluation documentation, and just, when I say clinical evaluation documentation, I don't just mean the CER, because I think there's a misconception that clinical evaluation documentation only includes the CER, but I mean, all the other clinically relevant documentation based on your device class. For example, if you're an implantable device or high-risk device, you might need an SSCP. And you also have the IFU, despite the fact that the IFU is shared amongst the different technical fields. You do have clinically relevant information within the IFU. So in general, clinical documentation holds a very, very heavy weighting in the entire technical documentation. And if your clinical documents and your clinical package is flawed, then it means that you don't have a complete technical documentation submission. So I can't emphasize enough how important it is to get it right. When you're putting things together for your regulatory submission. The clinical evaluation documentation is also very important for even the regulators, like notified bodies and competent authorities, to assess your submission and to be able to ensure that the claims that you've made regarding your device, aligns with the evidence which you've provided. So as we all know, for every claim made for a device, you need to have clinical evidence to back it up. And remember, these are medical devices. They are going to be used in a clinical setting. So if your clinical documentation isn't right, there is a very, very low chance of you making a successful submission or even getting your device successfully certified.
And you mentioned there's an acronym that you mentioned there. Was it SSCP? Was that the acronym that you mentioned?
Yes.
What is that exactly?
So the SSCP is, I suppose, the long form. It would be the Summary of Safety and Clinical Performance. This is a document that was introduced under the MDR, so meaning that it didn't exist under the directives. And the SSCP would be mostly for devices that are implantable devices. That's the requirement as per the MDR, that every implantable class 3 implantable device would have an SSCP. It is a document that the manufacturer should include all the safety information about the device, but not only safety information, the risks, relevant risks related to a device, but also, you should have things like your intended purpose statement. And then again, I think we're now many years down the road now with the MDR. It's not new anymore. So there is a guidance document for the SSCP 2019-9, where, if you follow the template, every notified body will be using that template to assess your SSCP. So it's very important that, despite the fact they say the MDCG guidance documents are not legally binding, believe it or not, notified bodies use them to assess your submissions. So it's something that's a bit tricky because from my experience, I would have got a lot of questions about, well, the MDCGs are not legally binding and the MedDev is not legally binding. But you have to understand that when a notified body is assessed during an audit by the competent authority, they are using these guidance documents to assess the submission and to ensure that the notified body is performing their duties as required. So, one thing I have to emphasize on this webinar is that, these MDCG guidance documents are taken seriously by notified bodies, and they are used during the course of the review. So it would be wise that manufacturers use them and don't underestimate the guidance documents. And we understand that the regulation takes the final say, but without the guidance documents, you won't have the best guide or the best pathway in order to get and achieve what the regulation is asking you to do.
And I suspect we'll probably hear about MDCG guidances a couple times throughout the discussion here today. So thank you for elaborating that a little bit more. Let's jump into the next question here. What exactly are the essential components of a comprehensive clinical evaluation report? You mentioned having it be complete, et cetera, is really key to operating efficiently with a notified body. So what are the essential components therein?
So I suppose we all know that the CER is the most important document in the, amongst the clinical evaluation documentation. The CER is a document that, includes and should include all the clinical evidence related to your device or the device under evaluation. And because it is an all-encompassing document, it has to be properly written. And the MDR sets out requirements as to what a CER should have, but also commonly notified bodies would use the MedDev 271 Rev 4 as a guide in knowing what your CER should have and as a guide in reviewing your CER. So, with regards to the MedDev, the essential components, first of all, a CER should have a scope. You can't just present a CER. And I think, we have seen cases, or I would have seen cases where, you have a CER which is about maybe 5 pages, and I'm not exaggerating. So, and I think, a good understanding of the MedDev 271 Rev 4 would help a manufacturer in knowing what they should include in their CER. So the first thing I'd say is you need to have a scope, and your scope section should talk about the device under evaluation. What are the devices that you're presenting to the notified body for review? But not only that, you need to list all the models of the device you're presenting for review. You need to list all the iterations of this device. So if you have had changes in the past up to the current state of the device at the moment, you need to list all that, and you need to give a discussion there in the scope section. You also need to talk about if there are sizes, if there are various sizes of the device. And so, the scope section is not just introducing the device, but you need to talk about, say, if the device has a regulatory history with regards to, has it been CE marked before? Are there other regulatory certifications, like, does it have an FDA certification? Has it been approved on the TGA? So the scope section is really, and I think, from my experience, a good scope section really helps you ease into, it will help a regulator ease into knowing and having a good understanding of your device before they get into the main contents of your CER. And the scope section, which I know this is something a lot of manufacturers probably don't know, that is where you need to talk about if your device is novel. So novelty is something that has come up under the MDR, and it's something that is becoming very, there's a lot of information about, and there are a lot of comments about novelty. So that is the section where you talk about if your device is novel, because you understand that a notified body seeing the novelty aspect, that's where they have to make the call if you're a class 3 implantable device or a class 2 active device that administers or removes medicinal substance. That is where a notified body makes the call if they're going to go CECP, which is the clinical evaluation consultation procedure. So taking out and failing to include the novelty and the novelty information, that is only if your device is novel, of course. If it's a new innovation or a new technology, then you have to state it in the scope section and describe how and what makes it novel. So when I say novel, I'm not talking about your device has some sort of unique thing that, it makes it, we're talking about novelty as per, what the definition of novelty is under the regulation. And there is a special position paper on novelty as well. So, and I know I'm really taking this slowly because I'm talking a lot about the scope section. And like I said, the scope section is very important. It gives a nice introduction of your device and what devices you're evaluating, that we are evaluating, notified body evaluates. And then you also go into the section where you call the state-of-the-art section. So state-of-the-art section and the clinical discussion section of the CR. So this is also a big section where the manufacturer talks about what your device is doing. For example, if your device is used to treat heart failure, this is the section where you have to talk about what heart failure is, what is the pathophysiology of heart failure, what is out there, and what is the current state of the art for treatment of heart failure. And that's where you kind of delve into discussions as to whether, are they unmet needs for the treatment of heart failure? Or you also go into, your literature search, your state-of-the-art literature search. So as we already know, there are two types of literature searches. There's the state-of-the-art literature search and the device under evaluation literature search. In the state-of-the-art literature search, you want to try and see what the current clinical guidelines for I suppose, if your device is used to treat heart failure, you want to see what the clinical guidelines are. You want to talk about that. You want to also talk about if there are new treatments regarding heart failure and how your device compares with that. And the information you're going to put in this state-of-the-art section or the clinical background section would be really an output of your state-of-the-art literature search. So that's a very good section, and that should be a very comprehensive section in your CR. And I don't think a CR is complete without it. And then you go into your, you have to talk about, the intended purpose of your device as well. In that section, you have to talk about what the device does. And intended purpose is something that I know that some manufacturers struggle with regards to trying to phrase a perfect intended purpose statement. And when it comes to intended purpose statement, your notified body takes this very seriously, because the intended purpose of your device determines the risk of your device, and it determines the class of your device. You don't want to have an unambiguous intended purpose statement. You want to have a very, very direct, very concise intended purpose statement. However, it should cover everything that your device is doing. And you have to note that any claim that you make in your intended purpose statement, you have to have clinical evidence to support it. So that's why the intended purpose statement is very important. You also have to have a device description in your CER. The device description talks about, what, not only, what your device is, but the physical components of your device, the chemical, if it's a chemical device or chemical related device or everything, you have to include this, but you also have to include an image of your device. And this is something that very often we would see, I would have seen cases where, we don't know what the device looks like, and in that case, you would, in that case, if you don't have a good device description, you might get additional questions from a notified body, because the device description helps them to understand what your device looks like from a physical point of view, physical components, the biological components, the chemical components, if possible. If it's a software, you need to talk about, from a software algorithm point of view. And you need to include this, and it has to be a good description in your CER. I might just go back to the intended purpose statement, because the intended purpose statement is very important. And one thing I have to state is, when you're drafting out your intended purpose statement, make sure you go to MedDev 271 Ref 4 Appendix A3. That is how your notified body will assess your intended purpose statement. If you don't have a clear intended purpose statement that really covers the indications of your device, I find that Appendix A3 very, very good, because it helps you know, and you kind of compare, does my device do this? Does my device do this? And in that way, you can construct a nice intended purpose statement, but you have to note that whatever intended purpose statement you have, it has to be consistent across all your clinical documentation. So, for example, you have your intended purpose statement in your CER, that should be the exact same statement in your IFU, the exact same statement in your risk management documentation, as well as your CEP and SSCP, as I said earlier. So all the relevant and clinical relevant documents or any other document where an intended purpose statement comes up should be the exact same. And there are cases where if you don't get your intended purpose statement right the first time, you will get questions from your notified body. And that might lead you to going back to all these documents I've mentioned and having to update that. So it will be stressful, to having to go back to these documents when you have had questions that would lead you to update the intended purpose. So that's why I wanted to come back to it, because I can't emphasize enough how important it is to get it right. I'm going to go into another very important aspect of the CER, and that is the device under evaluation section. So I think I've already covered a bit of it with, talking about intended purpose of the device description. But that is where you have to talk about similar devices as well. Are there other devices like yours? Are there devices out there that, and that's kind of where you weigh. But you also talk about your device and you focus more about your device and how it's meeting the clinical needs, what makes it stand out, what makes it different, all the claims you've made and what you're going to use to support that. And that's really, I find the device under evaluation section another very important component, because that's where you have the opportunity to really present your device in a good way that a notified body would be able to understand it. And then, the next section is, under the device under evaluation section. That is where you also talk about the clinical evidence in which you're presenting to support your device. So this will bring me into Article 61, where you have to choose the clinical evaluation route. So one thing I would have observed in my days in a notified body would be that a lot of manufacturers struggle a lot in choosing what the right clinical evaluation route is for their device. You see, some manufacturers are low-risk device manufacturers, but they would have chosen a high-risk clinical evaluation route, as per the MDR. So Article 61, say 6A, which is only for implantable and class 3 devices. And if you're a 2A device manufacturer, you shouldn't be claiming that. And I know there are some things that really don't make sense, because, you could get questions like, well, if a high-risk device manufacturer can choose this article, I'm a low-risk device manufacturer, so it shouldn't be a big deal. But from a legal point of view, you cannot choose an article in the MDR that only is subscribed for implantable and class 3 devices. So this is something that I would have seen very frequently. And I think it's always good to get your classification right at the start. If your classification is right, it helps you choose the right clinical evaluation route. So in your device evaluation section, you want to be able to present what the clinical evaluation route is. What clinical evidence are you presenting to support the safety and performance of this device? And that's really a section that if it goes wrong, everything else goes wrong. If you're claiming an article that doesn't support your device class, then you've already failed from that point of view. So, and I probably will come back to it later, but also you have to talk about, if you're a manufacturer claiming equivalence, that's also where you need to talk about, the equivalence claim. And, equivalence is something that has always been, even under the days of directive, that has always been a bit complex. But under the MDR, you have to use MDCG 2020-5, and that's a very good way to start your equivalence claim by making sure you look at the template. So as I said earlier in this webinar, notified bodies still use the MCCGs to assess your documents. So if you're going to need, and if you want to have a good starting point, you want to start with using the MDCG as a guide. So for equivalence, MDCG 2020-5 is a good start. That, I suppose, guidance might be updated soon, but in the meantime, that's what a notified body would use to look at your equivalence claim. They're going to use probably the template. They're going to see if your presentation of your equivalence aligns with the template, and that's where they're going to ask their questions from. So you want to make sure that you're holding on to that guidance if you're claiming equivalence. If you're performing a clinical investigation, which could be part of your clinical evaluation route, you want to make sure that in that device under evaluation section, you have presented results and discussions about the clinical investigation. But you want to make sure that you've also performed your clinical investigation as per clinical investigation standard EN ISO 14155, but also as per Annex 15. So it's all about, it's all about how the notified body looks at it and what they're going to use to look at it. And then once you've included all these things, the clinical data and all that, you have to include your PMS data. So PMS should be included in your CER. The CER should be a document that when a third party picks up and they look at the document, they can see everything related to the device. And remember, the CER is where you include the clinical evidence and clinical data related to the device. And PMS is a clinical data, it's part of clinical data. So you want to include the PMS data into the CER as well. But going on to finish off your CER, you also want to have a conclusion section where you have to talk about the device and all the evidence you've presented in your CER, weigh the benefits versus the risk, talk about how the benefits outweigh the risk, talk about talk about how you've tried to reduce the risks, and try to conclude. Obviously, you have to make sure that you're considering favorable and unfavorable data. So it's not a situation where you're presenting only the data that makes your device look good. Because at the end of the day, that's the purpose of your literature search. You want to make sure you get every information, not just the good parts of clinical data, but everything else, the risk and all the side effects and complications. But you also want to weigh at the end of the day your conclusion that the benefits still outweigh the risk. And then one thing that I would also advise is that you have your CER signed and dated. The CER is a proactive document. You have to, continuously update the CER. So you want to make sure that it's up to date, that the information that you have within your CER, that's your literature search and your PMS data, that you have given the notified body or the regulatory authority the most up-to-date data within the CER. Outdated data is already, an automatic, you will get an automatic questions. So you want to just avoid that, additional question that you could avoid. And every time you have a submission and you're making a submission to a notified body, you want to make sure you're giving them the most up-to-date data that, especially if you're a high-risk device manufacturer, that, the data is at least within 1 year or even 3 months. And if you're a low-risk manufacturer. So I suppose different notified bodies have what you're looking for, and it's always good to have that structured dialogue and engagement. But the CER should also be presented in a PDF format. And I think the MDR really specifies that every document within your technical documentation should be in a PDF readable format, that it should be readable and easy. So you don't want Word documents and things that could be editable when they're submitted. So when it comes to that, you want to make sure that the CER is signed, is dated, and is version controlled, but also that you have provided all the relevant, the authors and the relevant reviewers of the CER, that you've provided their CVs and their declaration of interest. And that's another document that your notified body will be looking for when you're making your submission. But at least that there should be one person amongst the authors or reviewers of the CER that has clinical expertise for the device under evaluation. So, if you want to get more information, you would see, additional information on MedDev 271 Rev 4. I know that the MedDev is currently being updated and transformed into an MDCG, but at this time, most notified bodies are using the MedDev, and that's the main document used as a guide to review your CER. So, because I didn't mention additional things here, I just wanted to really highlight the most important aspects of the CER and the essential components. So I'll be happy to answer any question at the end. I know some things are coming up on the chat.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you mentioned you've seen 5 attempts to compact that all into 5 pages. That does seem unbelievable. Yeah. To the point of the Q&A, lots of questions coming in. Thank you for all those. One thing I'll mention, there's also a little thumbs up button associated with each question. Go ahead, if you're seeing a question that you also have yourself and you'd like to see those answered, you can upvote those questions, give those a thumbs up, and we'll prioritize the questions that have the most upvotes, the most thumbs up, if you will. So go through and please do mark any that you would like to see prioritized at the end. And thank you for that answer to the question number 2. You mentioned a lot of potential best practices within that answer. Question 3 is really kind of digging into that a little bit more specifically. Could you share some best practices for ensuring completeness and compliance in clinical evaluation documentation? You've shared some of this already, so we might not need to spend too much time here, but would love to dig a little bit closer look at some of the best practices you've seen.
Yeah, I think the first and foremost, the most important would be start early. You want to start thinking about what clinical evaluation documents you're going to put together, even during your device development stage. So I'm not talking about legacy devices. I'm talking about, say, new manufacturers who are only just kind of getting into this. You want to start thinking, even during the developmental stage, what clinical evidence are you going to use to support your device? Are you going to use clinical investigations? Are you going to claim equivalence? Are you going to come in with, I suppose, are you going to come in with something new, or are you going to combine? What Article 61 sections are you going to be claiming? So always start early. Always try to see and consider what you're doing right on time, not towards the end. Another advice I'll give, which I touched on previously, is familiarize yourself with the current guidance documents. As I said earlier, notified bodies still use guidance documents, and they will be using that to assess your submission. So you need to read the sections of the MDR that talks about relevant to clinical evaluation. MDR Annex 14, MDR Annex 15 if you're performing a clinical investigation. You also want to familiarize yourself, if you're a legacy device manufacturer, you want to familiarize yourself with MDCD 2020-6, especially the Appendix 3, where it talks about what is sufficient clinical evidence and the whole hierarchy of sufficient clinical evidence. You want to familiarize yourself with all the guidance documents that are relevant, and you have to look at your device and see what's relevant and what clinical evaluation route you're choosing. So start early, familiarize yourself with what's important. Alignment and consistency is another thing. I think I talked about that earlier as well. For example, your intended purpose statement, it should be the same. There should be traceability across all the documents, and whatever inputs and outputs that are going into the documents, they should be consistent. For example, if you do a literature search and the outputs of your literature search, you come up with, say, complications like, infection related to device or similar devices, you want to link that into your IFU, and you want to align, and you want to also assess the risk of infection with your device. And based on that residual risk, you want to link it into your IFU. So I always emphasize with alignment, consistency across documents. You want to be saying the same things across these documents. Another thing is discuss with your notified body. If you don't have a notified body, you get one and have structured dialogue. Because I think, some manufacturers don't take up that opportunity to, have a structured dialogue with their notified body. We understand that notified bodies can consult, but you may be surprised that there'd be some questions posed during that structured dialogue meeting that would be red flags to them. And you want to pay attention to those questions, and there would be hints as to questions that would be asked during the actual review when you perform your submission, when you give your submission to that notified body. So you want to start that engagement with your notified body. You don't expect them to consult, but certain questions that they're going to ask you will give you a hint as to what could become problematic during the actual review. But also, if you're a high-risk device manufacturer, like an implantable device or class 2B active device that administers or removes medicinal substance, the MDR also gives this type of manufacturers an avenue to consult and engage with CECP. So I'm not sure how many manufacturers are using that. So the low-risk manufacturers, unfortunately, you may not get that kind of service, but the high-risk device manufacturers, the implantable device and the active 2Bs that administer or remove, they can go to the CECP as per Article 61.2, and they can consult and present their clinical strategies to the expert panel. And in that way, they can get guidance. So it's all about trying to gather what you can gather from all sides. So I'd say these would be my recommendations, for you to be in compliance. Also you want to make sure that you have your PMS data up to date and your literature search up to date. So being up to date is something that if you submit a document that is, that has outdated data, you would definitely get an additional question from a notified body. So you want to avoid that.
So starting early, familiarizing with regulations, completeness, consistency. We'll hop to the next one here. Question 4, getting back to lit review. What role does lit review play in the clinical evaluation process from what you've seen? Yeah,
so the literature search is very important. As we all know, you have 2 types of literature search within your clinical evaluation activity. You have the state-of-the-art literature search, which I touched on earlier, and you also have the device under evaluation literature search. The state-of-the-art literature search is where you look into what is the current guidelines, what is the current practice, how does your device measure into that, and what is current clinical standards with regards to that treatment, if your device is used for treatment or diagnosis, and that's where you're going with the state-of-the-art. Are there any unmet clinical needs? And then the device under evaluation clinical literature search would be really about your device. You want to go out there. If it's a legacy device, there might be papers and publications and peer reviews about the device. What's out there? What are end users experiencing? Because the literature search gives you a big bulk of real-world evidence data. What kind of side effects is your device experiencing, but also not only your device, the similar devices as well. And the output of your literature search will give you a good bulk of what your clinical data entails. So I find the literature search is very important on also knowing what type of risks to assess. And you feed that into your risk assessment, you assess the risk, and then you transfer that into your IFU. So it plays a very big role. You want it to be up to date. When you're performing your literature search, you want to ensure that you meet the requirements of MedDev 271 Ref 4. And I think that's, from my perspective, the closest guidance you can get as to how you can perform an effective literature search. I think it's Appendix A4, 5, and 6. You want to make sure that you have included the appropriate search terms, because your notified body, if you have to think about it, part of the role of notified body is to, under clinical anyway, is to verify that you have performed a comprehensive literature search and that your literature search is adequate. So in order to do that, they probably will go into, I suppose, the requirements of the regulation, but also the MedDev, which kind of gives a closer guidance as to how a literature search should be performed. The search terms has to be comprehensive and appropriate. You have to make sure that you've included the start and the end date of the search term. You also want to make sure that you've included the device under evaluation, and you've considered, maybe you can use different methods, but I think most times the recommended method would be PICO and Prisma. But there are other methods. I don't think you're limited to what literature search methodology you can use, but the notified body will be looking at what methodology and be assessing if that's appropriate for your device. And then the output of your search, you want to appraise the data and you want to see how it fits in, if they are duplicates. So a good and clear direction and methodology of your literature search will help and make it easier, not only for yourself, but also for the notified body when they're reviewing it. But it has to be comprehensive, it has to be up to date, and it has to be included and incorporated into all the clinically relevant documents, really. So it is that's really what I can say about the role of the literature search. But I find that the output of literature search not only goes in the CER, it goes in your IFU, your risk management document, your SSCP, because you would also get information about similar devices, not just the way your device is performing.
Thank you. The next question is kind of around pitfalls. So what are some of the consequences of poor clinical documentation practices that you've maybe even personally seen?
Yeah, so like I said earlier, early planning of your clinical documentation and figuring out what specific documents you need to submit is very important, and if you don't do a good job before you do that submission, it could lead to serious consequences, not only financial, but even for your device itself, getting on the market and things like that. So one of it would be delays in the review. So if your if your clinical documentation isn't right, you will have delays. It would lead to additional questions from your notified body for sure. And more questions from your notified body basically means multiple rounds of reviews. Most notified bodies have what you call a pre-submission service that they offer. And even with that pre-submission service, it is a paid service, I would think. And if it's a paid service, you are also going to be, if your documents are not right in that pre-submission service, it could lead to rejection before your review even starts. So delay in review, prolonged review time. You could also have situations where, it gives a very wrong impression of a manufacturer if your documents are not right and you don't have a good presentation. I talked about a 5-page CER. A 5-page CER already gives the regulator an impression that this manufacturer has not read the requirement and they are not ready. So I'm not saying that it biases the review, but it already kind of forms, that negative impression that, okay, it means that the other parts of the technical documentation might not be okay as well. But also, it could also lead to huge financial strain on the manufacturer. And like I said earlier, if you have multiple rounds, most notified bodies would have about 3 to 4 rounds. If you have multiple rounds, then they're spending more hours reviewing your document, more hours, more money. And so that could also upset your budget. So it could put a huge financial strain on manufacturers. It could also affect your launch date. It could lead to delays on your launch date if the documents are not right. And ultimately, it could also lead to rejection of your file. So once you've exceeded all the rounds and your documentation is not right, it could lead to rejection, and you might not get your device on the market. So it really it is significant. Every device needs clinical evaluation, from a class 1 to a class 3 device. So it's something that shouldn't be underestimated. It's always good to plan early, get your documents right. If you don't, additional questions, additional rounds, prolonged reviews, delays, and the worst nightmare would be rejection.
Are we talking months of delays? Are we talking potentially
really
years of delays?
Depends, because you have to understand that delays could be also from the review process. If the documents don't look right, additional questions. If you have a lot of questions, then the review could take more time. So it really depends on, and it will also be delays for the manufacturer to get what they need ready because they didn't get it right the first time. And so because of the multiple questions from the notified body, manufacturer has more work to do, and more work to do, it could take time. Depending on, some of them could get a consultant to write their CER, and that could take more time. So it really depends, Chris. It could be months, it could be days. It really depends on both sides. I suppose from a notified body's perspective, I know that a lot of notified bodies have hired more clinical personnel within their staff, under the MDR. So the staff issue may not necessarily be an issue anymore, but the delays could be because there are now additional documents to review. So they have to go through those documents because you didn't submit them the first time. So it really goes both ways as regards to, and also it's hard to predict, but it does have, and it does take a lot, and it holds a significant bearing on the manufacturer, both financially and, the unpredictability of when your device is going to get certified because you don't have the right documents.
Yeah. The next question is advice that you would give to new medical device companies or those that are new to clinical evaluation in terms of getting it right the first time. One of the Q&A questions ties into this a little bit. If you haven't commercialized your device yet, no PMS data available, how would you guide, or what advice would you give to those attendees that are in that situation, that kind of scenario?
So I'd say the first one is, I said that earlier, start early. So if you're a new medical device manufacturer, you need to start thinking about your clinical strategy during the developmental stage when you're developing the device and when you're thinking about what are the indications of your device, intended purpose. Start early and start to think about your clinical strategy. What clinical data would you like to present? Do you want to perform a clinical investigation, or do you want to go ahead and claim equivalence? Now, equivalence is almost impossible to claim under the MDR. So you kind of have to consider that, but start early. That's the first advice I'd give. The second advice would be early engagement with your notified body. Once you've thought about I suppose the device has been produced and you've thought about your clinical strategy, present that to your notified body. Present your clinical strategy, present, what documents you're going to submit for your device and the certification. During that structured dialogue meeting, you're going to have questions about what you've presented. And from my experience, when I go through the documentation or maybe a PowerPoint presentation from a manufacturer during the structured dialogue meeting, the questions I'm asking during that meeting are the same questions that would definitely, if not fixed, obviously, before the submission, would definitely be the same questions that would come up. I give you for an example. If your manufacturer that already has a clinical investigation, you've set your mind on doing a clinical investigation, and you already have the plan, and you've presented this in a PowerPoint to your notified body, what your clinical investigation method would be, the methodology of the trial, and maybe you've already even started a trial, and you present it to your notified body, and I remember I would have questions. If I had questions on, say, the results of the study or the methodology as to really gaining the actual clinical evidence to support all your claims, because you have certain claims in your intended purpose statement. If you don't try to consider those questions, most necessarily and most likely, it comes up again during your review. And it could be problematic because I know that clinical trials are very expensive to run. And if you don't know what you're doing and know what could be problematic before you actually go ahead to have those trials, then, it could lead to huge financial consequences. So early engagement with your regulatory authority or your notified body is very important. Present the strategy. They won't consult. They will tell you they can't consult, and really they really can't. But they're going to raise questions on the information you've given them just to understand your point of view. And you kind of have to write down those questions and consider those questions. Because if you don't do something about them, then it definitely would be a red herring in your review. And it could also lead to, like we talked about, prolonged and delays in your review. That's the second thing. I'd also say to new manufacturers, you need to familiarize yourself with the requirements of the MDR. You need to familiarize yourself with, related to your device, with Annex 14, Part A and B, Annex 15. If you're performing a clinical investigation, Article 61. If you're actually, obviously to help you choose your clinical evaluation route, you need to familiarize yourself with that. You also need to familiarize yourself with the guidance documents and see how it applies to your device. So that's really kind of what I'd be advising, but really structured dialogue, early planning, knowing the requirements and knowing the regulation really helps a lot.
Excellent. The next question is going to definitely touch on some of those topics that you've mentioned: early engagement, early dialogue. I'm looking. There's a question from the Q&A that I'll tie in here. You've touched on this. It's very important to engage early in the documentation process. What are the benefits? You've talked about some of those. I'll give you an opportunity to kind of put a fine point on this if you'd like, but also there's a question about what are the types of structured dialogues implemented by notified bodies to help in the submission process. So I guess just what are those types of dialogues, and if you'd like to put a fine point on this question as well.
I mean, when it comes to structured dialogue is basically having a conversation with your notified body. Your notified body wouldn't tell you what strategy to use, or they wouldn't give you solutions to the issues that they found in that during the conversation or during the presentation that you're giving. So I don't know, with regards to types of structured dialogue, I don't know if they are really broken down in types, but what structured dialogue basically is having that engagement with your notified body prior to your conformity assessment, really. But also, you can also have conversations during the course of the review. You know, we all know notified bodies can't consult, but during that engagement, you're going to notice that there would be several questions that would come up based on the material that you've given them to study in advance. And that's really where you need to pay attention. So it's very important to engage with regulatory authorities and to have that conversation, because it will help you avoid mistakes. It would help to make your review a bit seamless, as opposed to the hiccups because you didn't know certain things could come up. And sometimes notified bodies could tell you, say, for example, the documents to read, not directly, but they might mention certain documents, like you've heard me talk about MDCD 2020-5, you heard me talk about the MedDev. For the manufacturer, especially the new manufacturers that are not familiar, they're probably just familiar with the US system and not familiar with the EU system. They will use that opportunity to understand the additional documents they need to familiarize themselves with in order to know, what direction they're going. So it's very important to have that conversation and also keep that engagement. I also want to say something about engagement too. During the course of the review, you have questions that notified bodies are going to ask you related to your review and your submission and your device and all that. I think, from my perspective, it's always best to come back with responses quicker. Respond to your notified body as quick as you can to the best of your ability. I can understand that sometimes these questions might take time for you to come back with an answer, but try to keep that link, that you don't want to give it so much of a time from the last time you heard from them. So always keep in touch, always make sure that you're responding and you're going back to them with answers to the questions.
Excellent. Well, this will be our last question. That's kind of part of the formal slide deck here, and we have lots of Q&A questions. So thank you to everyone in the audience for submitting those and upvoting those. We'll get to as many as we can. We will probably go to 5 minutes past the hour to address as many of those as we can. So we'll briefly touch on this last question. Just kind of summarizing do's and don'ts that a manufacturer must be aware of prior to submitting their clinical documentation. And I'll let you finish with this one, Dr. Yvonne, and we'll jump into the Q&A at that point.
Okay, so, the do's and don'ts, I actually like this question because sometimes it's just the simple things about just making sure you get it right. The first one I'd say, I'm going to start with the do's. Up to date. So with clinical evaluation, because the definition of clinical evaluation includes continuous update, you have to make sure that you always provide up-to-date data. Don't provide an outdated information in your CER. So that's the first one. Second one is alignment and consistency and traceability. Always make sure that whatever you've provided aligns. So the clinical evidence that you've provided and the information within your CER aligns with the information, and there's traceability with the information in your IFU and the risk. So for example, if you have the risk assessed and you have the residual risk, you transfer it into your IFU, and you have also listed this in your CR. So that's something that I would say you should always practice. Next one is ensure that you are, ensure that you have signed copies of your CR, and ensure that you have provided CVs of the relevant people, because you're going to get questions on that if you don't provide that. But most importantly, ensure that you've chosen the right clinical evaluation route as per Article 61. If you get the clinical evaluation route wrong, it really affects everything really related to your clinical submission. So clinical evaluation route is very important. Sufficient clinical evidence is something that has come in under the MDR, and especially for legacy devices. So ensure that you are able to justify that data and the clinical data you've provided is sufficient and it's enough to support the claims you've made. So these are a couple of do's I would say related specifically to clinical. If you have all these things ready and you have read the MDR and the clinically relevant sections of the MDR and the relevant guidance documents in relation to your device, I think it's a good start before you make your submission.
Excellent.
And then
that brings us.
I didn't get to the don'ts.
Please do. Yeah, please do.
And for the don'ts, don't assume because your device is a legacy device that you're not going to be held according to the standards of the MDR. So this is something that I suppose maybe now it's getting better, but towards the early stage of the MDR, there was a misconception that because these are legacy devices, they've been in the market, they are not going to be reviewed as per the requirements of the MDR. So don't make that assumption. And then secondly, PMCF has to be done. Whether you're a legacy device or whether you're a new device manufacturer or a high-risk device, you need to have a PMCF plan and a PMCF report. You need to make sure that you've provided that as per the MDCG 2020-7-8. Also, you need to make sure that you don't, FDA is FDA, Europe is Europe. Make sure that you don't compare. I did see a question about, is the CR required for the FDA? So, if I have to flip that question, sometimes, some manufacturers think that because the FDA didn't ask for a specific document, then why is a notified body asking for that document? So, the MDR is not, it doesn't go according to the FDA requirements. So that's just something I'd like to say. Don't submit incomplete documentation. Make sure that your documents are complete, that your clinical investigation report is complete before you submit it, and don't make any claim that you don't have evidence to support. And I stop there.
Excellent. No, that's fantastic. We've got just a few minutes. We'll get through maybe even rapid fire. I don't want to rush you through anything, Dr. Yvonne, but we'll start with some questions here. So I want to share, I'm going off the highest upvoted questions here. First one, what alternatives can be pursued to gather clinical data for new devices that are not considered novel, especially since all available guidance primarily addresses either novel devices or equivalence demonstrations, but not specifically similar devices? Any thoughts there?
Sorry, you're just rushing the question. I'm just going to read it again.
I'm sorry.
Okay. To gather clinical data so what alternatives can be pursued to gather clinical data for new devices that are not considered novel, especially since all available guidance primarily addresses either novel devices or equivalent demonstration, but not specifically similar devices. So you're talking about new devices, but not novel devices. I think, from my perspective, I actually think new devices are kind of easier because with regards to legacy devices, is trying to get all that data. So with new devices, I would assume this is a device that is not in the market. So that's what I would think a new device is. In that case, I would say, you need to go back to the MDR. It depends on your class. Get your classification right. Make sure that you have the right classification so that you can choose the right clinical evaluation route. Obviously, if you're a high-risk device, you might choose some of the evaluation routes in Article 61. And then, make sure that you have read also the MedDev 271 Ref 4. And that's what I would say in order to help you determine what kind of clinical evidence and what is enough, as a new device based on the type of your device. If you're choosing clinical investigation as part of your clinical data, then you want to ensure that you're familiar with EN ISO 14155, but also Annex 15 of the MDR. These are there are certain guidance documents scattered around, even and I do understand that some of them are considering novel devices or legacy devices, but you also have to consider that there's some of them that are really applicable to your device. It depends on what clinical evaluation route you're choosing.
Excellent. Rapid fire, we'll go jump to the next. I'll let you read this one. I won't read it out loud. Everybody can read on their screen. So let's go ahead and drop this one from Lorena.
So please, in your opinion, can you specify which are the GSPR that should be supported by clinical evidence? That is a very good question. And it's a question that I remember during the start of the MDR, I would have asked that question. So it really depends on your device. There are certain GSPRs that are clinically relevant GSPRs, but I won't be able to give you and list specific GSPRs because I think it would be misleading, because it really depends on what device you're talking about here. It is a software, if it's an actual physical device, and what is the intended purpose? Is it going to be used in certain populations? So it's always good. The way I analyze the clinically relevant GSPRs, I look for the GSPR that are related to risk, patient safety, and clinical evidence and clinical data. And that's how, that's what kind of helps me assess what's the clinical relevant GSPR is. So, but Lorena, that's a very good question. And what you need to do is just make the attempt and try to look at all the GSPRs and see, based on your device, what's the clinically relevant GSPR? Which one has to do with patient safety? Which one has to do with clinical data? Which one has to do with risk, and so on? And also what your device is. I think that's a good starting point.
Excellent. Next question also got lots of upvotes. I feel like I could almost answer this, but Yvonne, that's what you're here for. Could you? I'll go ahead and let you read this one as well.
On how to define clinical benefit for a novel device. So you need to get this. There's actually, I can't remember the number of that paper. It's a paper. I really can't remember the number, but there is a paper on novel device. If you could Google that. But also clinical benefit, you could get that from definition of clinical benefit from the MDR. I think that definition still stands. Can this come from literature, or should this be through a clinical investigation? It can come from both. The clinical benefit of a device, you need to get the information from the clinical data itself. So you can get that from the literature, and you can get that from clinical investigation. It really depends. But if you kind of look at the definition of clinical data, if you look at the list of types of clinical data, those things could help you get information on clinical benefit related to your device. And for a novel device, I know that it's novel. There's really, it means it's a device that is really new, and there may not be any post-market surveillance data there. Then it might be clinical investigation. Then you want to get your own sponsored data.
This might be the last question here. This one again received the most upvotes. Sharing this one from Steffi here, and we'll wrap after this. Yvonne, there's lots of questions. We'll send those to you, of course.
So, how to present clinical evidence on devices that are not typically the focus of clinical studies? Surgical instruments. Possible to have state-of-the-art and clinical evidence level 7 MDC 2020-6. So it depends on surgical instruments. So you might get indirect clinical evidence. I think there's something like that, indirect clinical data. But I would think sometimes there are surveys as well. It really depends on the class of these surgical instruments. If they are low-risk surgical instruments, then maybe a survey could help. I just have to put a disclaimer here. If I don't know the device, it's hard to really give advice on that. But in general, where you feel that it's not totally focused on, on clinical studies, you might need things like surveys, and you might have to, if it's a legacy device, then as you said, you may have to look at the hierarchy of data there to determine in MDCG 2020-6 Appendix 3 to determine if, what you think is sufficient clinical evidence for your device.
Wonderful. Yvonne, we'll wrap here. We have at time here, a little bit over. I wanted to give everybody an opportunity to learn where they can find you. I found you on LinkedIn. It was really easy. But where can everybody find you?
Yeah, at the moment, I'd say LinkedIn is where you can find me. You can just check my name or search my name on LinkedIn and you'll find me on LinkedIn, and you can pop in a nice message there. And I'm very quick to respond. So I'd get back to you. So if you have additional questions, or if you need to get more information on the things I've discussed today, currently I consult with manufacturers, and I help also in training manufacturers for with their clinical evaluation documentation. I help them to look at their pre-submission documents and ensure that they have the right documentation prior to submission to a notified body. So if anybody wants to get in touch, you can get in touch with me through LinkedIn. But I just want to say thank you, everybody, for your time. Clinical evaluation and documentation and all things clinical, I know that it could be challenging and is very vast and broad. And I know that sometimes less than an hour could be also too short to cover everything, but I tried to touch on as much as I could.
You certainly did, and we appreciate that. As one final reminder, today's recording and the presentation slides will be sent to you in the following days. I want to thank everyone for attending today's presentation. Have a great rest of your day, and thank you, Yvonne.
Thank you. Bye.